So Dana, we're back.
Yeah, we are.
So what are you loving and not loving?
Very personal lovins, not lovins today.
McLovin.
McLovins, I know. Okay, everyone will just have to stay tuned, but Bose have these new earbuds out. Have you seen these?
My favorite Peloton instructor did a demo on it. I'll send you the Instagram.
Okay, well, Rose knows this. I don't know if the listeners know this, but I can't stand earbuds. They give me headaches. I don't care if they've got the special small little inserts for small ears. I can't stand them. And so I'm literally the only person on the face of this earth that does not use earbuds. Like I don't use them on planes. I don't use them when I'm walking. They give me a headache. And so this could be a game changer for me.
I got a review for you. I'll send it on over.
Well, I will say I have bought them and I will be trying them on a business trip, which leads me to also what I'm not loving, which is that I have to pack for a long business trip. So tell me, how long have we been traveling for business, right?
35 years.
And Rose, every time I can't stand packing. I dread it. And when it's a business trip, you can pretty much plug and play, right? You know your go-to outfits. If it's not the same client, you keep going to the same thing. And still, I hate it so much. I can't stand it. So anyway, that's my lovin', not lovin' McLovin'.
So I am not loving that it's getting over 100 in Arizona. So I've got to get out early or I don't get out to hike, which kind of disturbs my morning coffee and reading time, but I'll deal with it. But the flip side of that is with the heat comes a bit of travel. So I'm loving that I'm in like 5 weeks going to get to see D-Boz in person, face to face, and her neck of the woods. So that'll be fun.
Yep. And I believe you also have a trip to Iceland planned.
I do. We're going to do Iceland in the later summer. So yeah, I'm anxious because it's one of those places that I want to get to before it kind of gets too many tourists, which I have a feeling it's probably already like that.
It's probably already there, but still anyone I know who goes is like fabulous trip, totally worth it. So
can't wait. Can't wait. So we're going to do something fun and different today.
Yes, we are.
So as we were deciding how to proceed through the summer, we have closed on an idea where we have found some themes across the wonderful interviews that we've done in season 2. And so we have pulled those themes. We're going to be doing some compilation episodes where around that concept or that idea that we heard repeatedly across multiple interviews, we'll pull the quotes in, we'll add some more of our own insight and commentary, and then allow you a kind of a condensed version to grab some management and leadership learnings in around more specific topics and more bite-sized servings.
Bite-sized servings. Bite-sized. A niblet.
A little nugget.
All right, so we're going to dive right in. And the topic of the day is
Imposter Syndrome.
Yep, there it is. Leading with that. Those of you that did listen to multiple episodes, it was surprising how this came up, and it was not prompted by us. We were not asking questions like, so have you ever felt imposter syndrome?
Yeah, and it's really interesting because I think you've also, if you do any reading in management, leadership, personal development, there's been a number of articles, some in Harvard Business Review, kind of putting a critical lens on the term imposter syndrome. But we can't deny the fact that talking to these high-level leaders, successful people, that this theme came up. So you can't ignore it. You may be able to argue the concept about what it's creating in terms of a mental approach or concern around labeling people with imposter syndrome, but it did come up frequently. So we're going to hit it.
And let's, just for the purposes of our discussion, define what it is for us, which is this feeling that either I'm not qualified to have this role or I don't belong at this table. Or as Rose was saying in the Barb episode, that she realized her biggest fear was I'm a fraud. People don't realize that it's just ridiculous that I'm in this position, that I'm running a group. And so that's how we're defining it, is that feeling. And I will tell you, the first time I actually heard the concept was my friend who was starting graduate school at Columbia. And she was telling me this story about how she was sitting in orientation with all the other people in any of the graduate schools. So it was huge. And the dean or president of the school was saying, I bet each of you is sitting in this room right now wondering what went wrong in the application process that they would let you in. And that somehow everyone around you deserves to be in this room, but you somehow snuck in and you don't really have it. You don't really have what it takes. And I thought that was so clever, the way that that woman put that on the table for all those students. And that was my first time hearing about what it was. Not that it wasn't my first time experiencing it, but I just didn't have a name until then.
Well, and the first time that I had realized that it is a pervasive concern at different levels of leadership, I had just finished, I'd say, my first or second year with Barb as my coach. And I was talking to another woman at Intel who was an executive that was considering using an executive coach to continue to further her career. And I started asking her, like, what are some of your concerns? And she didn't use the word imposter syndrome, but the same type of concerns started to surface and come up. And I said, join the club, sweetie. Join the club, sweetie. Join the club. And you know what was interesting is in the Esther episode, she specifically talked about, I'm not ready. I'm not qualified, when they approached her. So let's listen to Esther and see what she has to say about her experience with what we're calling imposter syndrome.
I would say earlier in my career, and at the beginning of my career, I was probably a victim of that perfectionist complex. So I actually didn't speak up a lot in meetings. I mean, some of it's you're beginning your career. And yes, I went to business school, and I think that helped me with my confidence, but I was still a little bit on the quiet side, non-assertive, watched, learned, as that era. And I remember when, granted, it was, the internet, it was kind of crazy times. But I remember, had been promoted a few times and whatnot. And at one point, the head of our New York office was exited. I was working at an agency at the time. And they said, can you be president? Can you be interim president? I thought they were crazy. I was like, what are you people talking about? I am so not qualified. I am so not ready. I am so no. Like, I actually said, no, like, I can't do this. And then I eventually did. And it was just the first of many subsequent moments in my career where I just never felt ready. I never felt necessarily completely qualified, but I learned you just have to lean over your skis and actually be logical, be strategic, but also be yourself through a combination of those things. I would say I continue to find myself in situations where I'm often leaning over my skis, but I don't know. I thought I would feel more comfortable by now, and I guess I do. But I guess my advice to others would be, particularly for women, I'm not sure, but you just have to know enough to be able to lead, and then you have to be enough of a human being to know how to manage. I know it's not that simple, but I would say that it just felt like such a shocking moment. And somehow I find myself in situations where I get thrown things and I'm like, oh, okay, all right, let's give it a go. Let's go. Yeah. And I'm like, at this point, I'm like, that's a formula of at least my success. You don't always have to have it all figured out.
So honestly, what she's saying, I realize now, anyone taking on any significant challenging role pretty much feels that way. So it was just this huge light bulb going off for me when I realized that almost anyone, male or female, by the way, this is not just about women, are like, I don't know if I know what I'm doing. And maybe there's data that shows men are more willing to jump in than women are. But still, there was everyone, when I realized that everyone sort of is like, I don't really know what I'm doing. I think everyone else here does, but I don't. That was really illuminating. And I will say, you made this point before the Esther clip, almost anyone who takes on a people manager role or running a huge project where they have to coordinate a lot of people will have this feeling of, wow, everyone's looking at me like I know exactly what to do. And this imposter syndrome feeling is just so common for so many of us. And I have a different, it's a quick example. It's a slightly different because it wasn't about me managing, but I was taking on a significant role where I was asked to support an executive vice president who was an extremely impressive person. This was also at Intel when I worked there. And, in general, I don't know why, but I generally didn't get intimidated by a lot of people. Like, I would recognize that there were people that knew more than me, but that didn't make me feel smaller or insecure, right? But suddenly with this person, I did. And I remember saying to my manager, because I was supporting him as a leadership development, org development kind of person. I remember saying to my manager, and by the way, if there's any question about how much power a manager can have for someone, this is an example. And it was so rare for me. And she knew this was rare, but I literally was having a crisis of confidence in a one-on-one where my voice got all weak and quivery. I was in my early 30s, by the way. I was just like, who am I to be saying anything to this guy? Literally, I was basically saying, who am I to even be in the room? And he was, by the way, 30 years older than I was, and so on. And I'll never forget what she said, which was, she looked at me and she said, well, you're saying, why am I even in the room? And I would just say, well, why not you in that room? And that made me stop for a second. And she said to me, Dana, you've been invited into that room because you have a skill set and a knowledge set that those people don't have. They might have accomplished a whole bunch of stuff, and they might be more experienced than you in terms of years in the workplace, but they don't have what you have. And they're inviting you in. And that changed it for me. Now, I can't say I walked in with a bunch of swagger. I was still pretty intimidated, but she got me over the hump of this, who am I to even be in the room?
Well, and I think that's a really good pivot, Dana, because I think we've established through our general stories, through Esther's experience, through different stories we've heard, even from Roly in his episode, that it's a pretty pervasive feeling. Now, if you want to call it imposter syndrome or not, we can debate that for a while. But I think it's really important for our listeners to now understand, what can we do as individuals? What can we do as managers? What can we do as leaders? And you just gave a great example of what your manager said. Why not you? And I saw something, interestingly enough, this morning on Instagram that really talked about the power of intention. So maybe another interesting approach or tip if you're feeling that way. And the concept is, number one, embrace and learn from failure. You're going to learn so much more from your failures than you ever do your successes. Point one. Point two is pin your confidence on your intention versus your outcome. So if you generally believe you have good intent, you're a good person, your input was to move the conversation forward or to give a presentation that inspired, and you missed the mark a little bit, know that the power and the confidence comes from the intent, and the improvement comes from the failure and the learning.
Yeah, and it might not be as black and white as failure, right? It might just not have gone as well as you wanted it to, but you probably still delivered value. And so learn from what didn't go the way you wanted, but recognize that you still probably brought some value.
Yeah. And I thought the other thing, and we talked about my story at a bit of length in our Barb episode, where she tells the story of me laying on the couch wrapped up in a blanket. and expressing my fraudulent approach. But I thought she also had some really good advice on how she helps people. So now put yourself in her seat. Think about yourself as a manager or leader, maybe seeing this behavior in one of your employees. And let's listen to what Barb has to say about how she helped me personally through what I learned after was imposter syndrome.
When I do meet a client, and I'm sure you'll remember this, it's confidential. There is no judgment. I call it an intimate relationship, and there's nothing more to it than it's close and it's safe and a safe space. That's the other thing. It has to be a safe space. And we talked it through, and I said, where did this come from and how in the world? And I think I had your resume with me, and I pulled it out, and I said, okay, you've done this and this and this. What part of it is fraudulent, and which part should I report to your boss? Because you've got to loosen it up a little bit, because it's a real fear. And then we talk about, well, how are you dealing with this and how are you dealing with that? And then ultimately what it comes to, and that's how the development of my theory of bone deep self-confidence comes, because Rose had everything that was positive going for her. And I mean, she really did. And so getting to the root cause, and I also do the disclaimer, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a psychologist. So please understand this is just from my experiences, that, and it's a process. It then becomes a process in terms of, okay, let's set up these things that you're going to do, and you're going to report back to me how it happened and how it recovered. And, I remember you had some concerns about your financial ability to read. And so I did a session with her on P&Ls and things like that. And it went away.
So Dana, I thought that was really interesting to listen to Barb's approach. The other comment that I really loved was from Roly about what he does around continuing to learn and engage. So he's still reaching out to the people that he worked with on the line to just test, gain feedback, test, learn, modify, continue to be accountable.
Well, I thought Roly was a good example, and frankly, many of the people we've talked to, but Roly in particular was a good example of Barb's point about bone deep self-confidence. So he was saying, if you want to know how to navigate imposter syndrome, it's have confidence that you know what you know. You know what you know you're bringing some value, and you probably have a right to be there. But don't let that turn into arrogance, right? And so he was talking about how he very actively with his colleagues who are still on the line, meaning in the field or their craft tradesmen, and then also with his Princeton friends. We congratulate each other, but we also make sure that we're learning from each other and that we're not taking ourselves too seriously. And it's sort of like you navigate imposter syndrome with that balance that's confident but not arrogance. It's this willingness to learn. You know what you know, and you're going to be willing to learn to figure the rest out. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so let's listen to those comments from Roly.
It was also that willingness to be vulnerable and say, hey, I don't know, but I'm going to learn from you as long as we can have that communication back and forth. To me is, again, I think it goes to your original question is how do I lead different from, let's say, my dad or others? Is this the way I came up through the business? I'm out there as some of the foremen were laborers when I was in the field. And we kind of make sure we check in on each other, that nobody's head's getting any bigger. And that it's hey, I remember when, I remember when you bailed me out of a stupid decision I made, and let's keep that between us. And that, to me, that's leading by example, and remaining and keeping that some level of humbleness is very important.
So there you have it. I find his takes just very grounded, very refreshing for a CEO. And I also just want to say to our listeners that he continues to share more about his quote unquote imposter syndrome in the second Roly Acosta episode. And in my opinion, it's the best take on how to navigate imposter syndrome I've ever heard. So I really encourage everyone to go to it.
Yeah, so to wrap this, our first compilation episode, let's hit the high points. Imposter syndrome. You may like the term, you may not like it. It exists and it's pervasive. There are tools, approaches, conversations that you can have as a manager, a leader, as given by the examples from Barb and Roly, There are things that you could do personally, which is, again, embrace your ability to learn from maybe your not perfect execution or your failure, and make sure you're gaining your confidence and your intention, not just the outcome. And with that, I would like to thank you for listening. Remember to subscribe, to follow, both on Spotify and Apple Podcasts for the pod itself. Please find our LinkedIn page as well as our YouTube channel, all under Maestro Mindset. And you know what we haven't done, Dana, that we need to do?
What?
We need to give a shout out to our producer.
We sure do. We absolutely do.
Especially for this episode.
Yes. Thank you, Fina Charleston, who has the best accent ever.
Yeah, and she's been phenomenal this year. We want to thank her, and we look forward to sharing our next compilation episode with you soon. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.